Hey everyone, welcome to the Retro Gamers Podcast. I'm here in beautiful Brooklyn, New York, because you know what? It was my birthday last week, and Anthony, I still see the smile on your face. You know, you still took too much joy.
Yep.
No, hold on. You took too much joy in what you did. What's happening? All right, so I'm flying in. All right, so I'm flying in people to try and fix the Virtual Boy. That's costing me a lot of money. So, you know what? I'm going to hang out here. I'm here at WrestleMania weekend. I'm here at Fan Access, and I picked up a lot of stuff already. You know what, Josh? I'm happy you're here. We were going to do the three of us, but I'm out. Check out Talking More Wrestling. Check me out. Check out Victims and Villains. You guys figure out what to do on the show. I'm going to go enjoy WrestleMania. Peace out.
Well, it looks like that's pretty much the extent of what Larry's going to do on the show this week, because he's apparently out. Josh, thanks for showing up, because otherwise I'd be doing this solo.
No problem, man. You know, I can't leave you high and dry. And I mean, one could argue that you technically upgraded co-hosts. So
Who
really wins in the long run?
You know what? I am going to consider this an upgrade, because I think Larry is taking what happened last week a little too harshly. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, but I think this also is like the first step at me actually taking over all of Larry's shows. I'm setting my sights probably next on Better Half.
Well, I'm sure Frank would love to have you take over for Larry once in a while. But anyway, everybody, welcome to the Retro Gamers Podcast. Anthony here, and I am joined by Josh from our one of our favorite podcasts, Victims and Villains. He's been on the show before. Josh, as always, welcome.
What's up?
Yeah. So
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. What's happening with you? Let's hear what's been going on in your world.
We are as a podcast, we are gearing up to episode 200 at the end of this month, which is exciting. And we are basically going to kind of like restructure our show just a tad bit after episode 200. We just picked up a band out of Florida that is disbanding, that is breaking up, that is going to be providing us with a brand new theme song, and the new theme sounds amazing.
Oh, cool.
And it really aligns with our message of suicide prevention. And we're basically, after 200, like, we're really starting to hit the ground running to be more serious about our nonprofit status, for one, and we are also introducing some new faces to our show. And some more steady faces, or voices, for lack of a better word. But basically, we're going to be launching a rotation of co-hosts, which is exciting.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Now I have to ask. So this band that's making your new theme, you said, is breaking up. Now, are they breaking up because of the theme that they're making for you, or what is that just coincidental?
So actually, last year we had a chance to actually do a music festival, and I met my friend Corey at that festival, and they did a set, and during their set they played a song called Prodigal, Don't Be Afraid. And basically the whole course of the song was, like, the bridge of the song is, step back from the multiple ways of suicide that you can perform, and realize that you have value and that you have worth, and that just because it looks bad in this season doesn't mean that it's not going to look bad in the next season. And it really stuck with me. And so, like, Corey and I, like, after they had played, like, we were almost inseparable for the remainder of that day. Like, we just talked so much, and then talked so much the morning before church the next day. And we had talked about him, like, he had interest in doing podcast, and he came and did our Captain Marvel review, and that's where they had premiered the song. So, like, they were touring last year, and then they had said, "Hey, this is basically going to be it for us," because they had just lost like all the members of their band right before the tour. Went and did the last couple songs that they had for EP. They're planning one more tour, and then they're done. So it's just basically just like the perfect storm of like all like creative juices and life flowing. That's the reason why. But I really like the song, and I really wanted to immortalize the song on like in our universe. So I offered him the chance to have it as a theme song for our show.
All right. Well, and that sounds great. I'm looking forward to hearing that, and I'm sure all of your listeners are looking forward to hearing that. And also, something else to bring up about you guys, and I know, I know this obviously because the Retro Gamers are going to be a part of this next week. But you're going to be doing another Hope Station live stream, and we're going to be a part of some of those live stream games.
Yes. So Hope Station live stream returns April 12th through the 14th, and basically we are doing a 48-hour game stream on our YouTube channel. So if you go to youtube.com/victims and villains, you can experience 48 hours of gaming goodness. We are gaming everything from Nintendo all the way up to modern age with Steam and stuff along those lines. We have a great crew of streamers that we've worked with in the past, and then we also have a brand new crop of streamers that we're bringing into this fundraiser. Basically, this fundraiser is to raise awareness of suicide prevention and to also raise money to get mental health resources into schools and conventions. And we have awesome giveaways that we're doing this time around. We like last time, everything that we mistaked on last time, we're going into prepared this time.
Okay. All right, cool. I think that'll be, and again, the last one that you did, we were, the Retro Gamers were also a part of it, and we had a blast. There are very few people I'll wake up for to game with at 5 a.m. Even though I get up at 5 a.m. anyway. But it's always, it's always, it's a lot of fun. Looking forward to doing it again. And yes, it's great that you're going to have more more or better giveaways this time. And so any of our listeners or people watching who are interested, please, check out next weekend, and we'll be promoting this on our page as well. The Hope Station live stream. But be that as it may, I think in memory of Larry, since he has already left us for this episode, and again, I think it was kind of in response to what happened last week for his birthday, where I kind of sort of delivered on a promise that I made last year. Now, I said I was going to do this. I told him that I would destroy the Virtual Boy had I won it. And I think what happened was he actually thought I had either forgotten it or I wasn't going to fulfill that promise. So I think he's just licking his wounds a little bit. And, based on where he was at the Long Island Sound, he was, maybe he was having, a funeral on the river or something like that, burial at sea type of thing. So while he cries over the Virtual Boy, we're going to get into the meat of this episode. And I just thought it was fitting, since last week we saw the demise of one of the biggest flops in the console industry, that we would continue that trend and talk about famous franchise flops, or get famous very well-known gaming franchises that also seem to have a couple of misfires here and there. And there are many.
I mean, if you really just want to stick in the camp of Virtual Boy to start off there, we could say Mario Tennis.
Oh yeah, Mario Tennis was a disaster. I'm sorry. As much as Larry, had you stayed on the show, you would have been able to defend it. But since you're not here, I remember Mario Tennis was the game that I actually played on the Virtual Boy with Larry when he brought it over to my house 20 years ago. 20 plus years. He's like, "Oh, you got to play this. This game is amazing." Literally 60 seconds in, I'm playing this thing and I'm like, "This is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't want to ever look at it again." And every other game, I don't think I played that many games on the Virtual Boy after that, but I did, like, peek in to look at other games, and it's just terrible. But Mario Tennis is a very good start. Not much else to say about it except you're watching a bunch of people in red. You're playing tennis. It's supposed to be virtual. Not really. It doesn't feel that way at all. So, Josh, have you ever played it?
I haven't, but I will say this, is that I will give props to Nintendo for the concept of the Virtual Boy, because they were trying to do something new, trying to do something that set them outside of it. And look, didn't work. That's all I gotta say about it.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't work.
I'll respect the efforts, but it didn't work.
Well, no, look, I mean, Nintendo's not one to shy away from being innovative, and we can always give them credit for that. They're always trying new things. In fact, they just announced this week that the Nintendo Labo kit that, for the Switch that they have, you're actually going to be able to play Super Mario Odyssey and Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild in VR with the Labo kit. So considering how VR is, VR isn't like the biggest thing going on in gaming right now. It has its small little niche market, and everybody seems to be kind of touching it, but I don't think nobody's really excelling at it yet. But Nintendo now seems to be making their way back into it with the Labo on the Switch, and the Switch is so popular right now that you know what? It may be a surprise, and we may actually get something VR from Nintendo that actually works well.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but PlayStation's the only one right now that, outside of mobile devices, that is actually really pushing the whole VR experience, correct?
Yeah, I think PSVR is probably the one that, to me, that's really pushing it the most. Everybody else seems to you have the Oculus here and a couple of other things, but PlayStation's really the one that's the main driver. In fact, I have a friend of mine who I'm going to visit today, who is being very insistent about me trying the PSVR. So I'm actually going to be trying it this afternoon for the first time. And I'll have a full report on next week's podcast on how the PSVR is.
Because I don't like the concept of VR, but after Larry described to me the horrific nature of Resident Evil and VR, I really want to try it. Just that one game.
Yeah.
I just want to be able to immerse myself in the horror culture.
No, and me too. I mean, trust me, I'm all about horror survival games, so being able to play them in VR sounds interesting to me. But also, something else that came out this week is they did a VR test. I don't know if it's a test run or a beta, or if it's the actual just experience. They did a VR run of Iron Man, where you step into the Iron Man suit and you get to be Iron Man. And from my understanding, everybody's coming out raving about this, saying this is the epitome of what a VR experience should be, and this is going to be the future of gaming. So whatever they did with that Iron Man, that Iron Man experience or game on VR, apparently it's pretty groundbreaking. So I'm definitely gonna be keeping my eye on VR moving forward, as opposed to going back 20 some odd years to what was the awfulness of the Virtual Boy. And if you want to see what I did to the Virtual Boy, please go to our YouTube page and check out last week's episode. Yeah, Josh, did you see the destruction?
I have not yet. So before we started recording, we were talking about catching up on work and you falling behind on work.
Yep.
I've been focusing so much on trying to get back up, but Larry was you gotta see it, and I was I will as soon as I can.
You definitely need to. There's no question about it. But let's move on to, we talked about Mario Tennis. Virtual Boy, is dead and buried as far as I'm concerned. I think that we can move on to some other franchises that had some, not so successful games. And since you brought up Resident Evil, there was actually one I had on my list for the Resident Evil franchise. There have been a number of games I feel that have kind of been a miss on Resident Evil. We all know that after when Resident Evil 4 came out, they completely changed the format of the gaming for the game for a while. It went from survival horror to kind of an more action adventure oriented game. And some people didn't sit well with that. But there was a specific game that came out actually that I found really interesting. That was that just I don't. It didn't matter how you tried to do this. I feel it just wasn't going to work. But they actually created a Resident Evil game for the Game Boy Color. Do you remember this? There was a game on the Game Boy Color called Resident Evil Gaiden.
That just does not seem like it would. Like, there are certain games that I don't care what you say that just don't port well to other systems.
Yes.
And Resident Evil, I feel like, is definitely one of those.
Well, yeah, true. But I think in terms of porting anything, making a survival horror Resident Evil game on a handheld system like the Game Boy Color doesn't sound all that appealing at all. Now, and when you look at it, the graphics are obviously extremely rudimentary. You're talking like, 8 or 16-bit graphics at best on a Game Boy Color. I believe it was more 8-bit. So you've got these little 8-bit characters kind of walking around on the screen, and then when you see the zombies, there's nothing menacing about it. Like, the coolest thing about Resident Evil on, even the first one on the PlayStation is when when the zombies turn around, they even on the PlayStation, they look blocky now, but back then they looked absolutely gruesome, and you were able to get surprises and all that stuff. But on the Game Boy Color, it was very colorful, it was very cartoony, and the graphics were so simplistic, it was really hard to take seriously. And on top of that, you've got the storyline, which revolved around a zombie outbreak on a luxury cruise liner. So it was basically Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan in a Resident Evil version with zombies. So none of it seemed to jive well.
No, that actually sounds like the plot of a terrible B movie that you would see on like Mystery Science Theater.
Right. Or yeah, exactly. Directed by Uwe Boll, if you know who Uwe Boll is.
Yeah.
He is responsible for some of the worst video game movies ever made. And we've actually talked about him at length on a previous episode a very long time ago. But he bears repeating at this point. So yeah, so Resident Evil Gaiden on the Game Boy Color was one of the first ones on my list that I wanted to discuss. Josh, now that you're fully caffeinated, exactly. Oh God, that's frightening. Now that you're fully caffeinated, what game do you have on your list?
I'm actually going to start off with a game that there's a little bit of history between the two of us, and when we met, it was basically like we just started like recording, and then our friendship kind of grew out of that. Then from that grew the idea to do these basically like corporate streams between victims and gamers. And the very first way we would do it is we would pick a topic of the month, and then we would each take a week. We would stream that specific game, that would relate to that theme. And
yes,
first one we did was Castlevania, and first thing that's on my list, Castlevania 64. What
of course it is
game. Man, everyone kept telling me how bad the game was, and I was like, it cannot be that bad at all. And it's a platform that flows kind of really smoothly up until the second level, and then the gameplay and the controls, it just kind of, they almost kind of become it almost seem like they have a stroke to where it doesn't flow as good as it did in the first level, to where it's really wonky in parts. And I don't know, how Castlevania I feel has good potential, but it's just not always the best. Let me try this again.
You're right there.
It's not always the greatest executed game in the world. It flows really well as a side shooter, but not necessarily as an open world.
Well, I think what happened, and I owned Castlevania 64, and I definitely played it. I never finished it. I got through maybe a third of the game before I said, okay, I can't suffer through this anymore. I'd actually preferred that Dracula killed me, but I remember, first off, I remember watching you stream this way back when, and I think you played for about an hour and could not get past like the first major bad guy, which was like this giant skeleton, and he just kept destroying you. And I actually gave you a lot of credit for trying to beat him for a good solid hour before giving up. And it had absolutely nothing to do with your gameplay per se, but it was just the mechanics of the game were so clunky and glitchy, and just like everything about this just did not work. And the game in and of itself just looked unfinished. So it's not necessarily that Castlevania can't foray into an open world third person perspective like that, or 3D perspective. It's just that they didn't really put the effort in the same way they did with like Super Mario 64. Because Super Mario, oh, bless you.
Thank you.
Super Mario 64 was, very fluid, ran really well, and it was fast. For some odd reason, the Castlevania game, they just couldn't get that, that mechanic down, and the whole game suffered because of it. And not only that, but they made two of them. Castlevania 64 wasn't the only one. There was also Castlevania Legacy of Darkness on the N64, which they basically took the same game and just, copy and pasted, and then changed the story up a bit and, the levels, but they never fixed all of the problems for the first one. So that one was just as bad.
Yikes. Like, I feel like you should learn from the first one. And like, to their credit though, like that whole era of video games, you are basically transitioning from a 16 platform or 16-bit platform to a 3-dimensional one. So I think that transition, like that whole period of transition is really murky if you don't know what you're doing. And I think that like PlayStation games that were coming out at the time that were basically indulging themselves fully into that technology, they worked because that's what they started on. But when you have a lot of developers that are so used to 8-bit and 16-bit, that when you make that transition, it's a little bit harder. And I don't fault them. Like it's kind of one of those things that, like, I don't know, like it is just the controls for it are like really wonky.
No, they really are. And not only that, PlayStation knew well enough to when they made their Castlevania game. Remember, before Castlevania 64 came out, we were treated to probably one of the best, if not the best, Castlevania games of all time, which was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. That was released on PlayStation and was released as a 2D side-scrolling action adventure everybody loved about Castlevania. But they made it so well that even though it was on the PlayStation, which was, obviously parlaying in everything into 3D, they kept the core, style of Castlevania, and it turned out to be one of the best games ever made in the franchise. So Nintendo, they didn't seize on that format because they were so gung-ho about, we're all about the 64-bit graphics, we're all about the 3D, so we're going to make everything in 3D. Didn't realize that, first and foremost, you need to make a great game. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be 3D to be a great game. So definitely a big misstep on them. And I'm glad you brought that game up because I was going to if you didn't. So
yeah, that's like usually like that's my go-to game when people like ask like what's the worst game you've ever played, and it's like it's either that or Superman 64. And Superman 64 I'll expand on just a little bit later, but yeah, it's usually my go-to game.
All right. Well, before we get into that mega turd, I'm going to switch over to, and you know what, mega turd's a good term to use right now based on the game I'm going to bring up, which is I don't know if you were a fan of the Duke Nukem series, but there was a
I know of it, but like I've never played any of the games.
Okay, so Duke Nukem was a first-person shooter. It's basically one of the I guess one of the franchise starters for first-person shooters because, way back when you had Duke Nukem, Wolfenstein, and Doom. Those are like the three most well-known first-person shooters to come onto the market. And Duke Nukem 3D, which came out in, I think, the mid to late 90s, was considered one of the best first-person shooters of its time. So obviously everybody was clamoring for a sequel. So the company 3D Realms, which developed Duke Nukem, started working on a game called Duke Nukem Forever. And you know what? Forever is the perfect, subtitle for this game, because that's how long it took to make. And when I say forever, I'm talking 13 years of development. Not only that, it took so long to make that 3D Realms, the company behind Duke Nukem, went out of business before the game was completed. It was actually completed after it was picked up by another company, Gearbox, and Gearbox wound up finishing it. However, when the game was finally finished 13 years later, it got panned so badly for being such a terrible, terrible game. And basically, the idea behind first-person shooters are, you have a big map that you get to walk around, and it's almost like a first-person open world in a way. Like Duke Nukem games, it's like you have a giant map, you go through these different rooms and everything like that, and whatever you find, you find. And, obviously you're searching to, destroy everything you need to, find what you need to eventually escape and beat the game. That was the concept of it. This game was more like a linear adventure. It was a first-person shooter, basically, where you just went from point A to point B, cutscene. Point A to point B, cutscene. There was no real free flow to it. So it was because of that limitation, a lot of people didn't like it. But not only was that an issue, but the content in the game was a big issue. And I say this with a perfect example, and I'm just going to read something really quickly, because in the first few minutes of the game, just to give you the idea on the tone that they wanted to set in this game, in the first few minutes of the game, your character pees into a urinal and then earns an achievement for reaching into a toilet and extracting a piece of human feces. Why does the game reward you for doing this? No idea. And they don't explain it at all. And then it goes on to other great moments, such as a pair of twins performing fellatio on you, to Duke Nukem shooting women who explode and then making jokes about abortions. Nobody knows exactly what they were thinking when they did this. And Gearbox actually went on record to say that they did not change anything 3D Realms did. All they did was finish the game because they didn't want to be responsible for the backlash that this game was getting once it was released. So, first off, Gearbox should definitely take responsibility for it because they released it. It could have very easily just been put on a shelf and forgotten, because let's face it, after 10 years and a company going under trying to develop the game, you could have just put it under, just forgot it ever existed and we would have been done. But they chose to put it out. So, hey, you know what? That was on you. Then on top of it, there was just nothing. There were no real redeeming qualities to this game, unless unless that type of humor appeals to you. And for that, more power to you. Just not my style.
Yeah, I would not want to play that game after the things that you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are sometimes that something that is like you wait forever it doesn't always translate as living up to the hype. It's really hard for video games to do that. Mm-hmm. It's kind of almost like, we went through Hollywood went through this phase a couple years ago where they were on this big nostalgia butt kick where they were greenlighting sequels to films that were 20 years or older. But I think while they had decent parts, not a lot of them didn't really live up to the original.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. In fact, the only one I can really think of off the top of my head that I thought was a worthy sequel, and a fantastic film, if you haven't seen it, was Blade Runner 2049.
Ooh, I saw that in theaters, and the theater that I saw it in not only was I don't know if it's a new type of theater, but basically it's it was almost like IMAX, without being IMAX, and then the seats had like speakers within them, and then every time like there was something that would like rattle on the screen, you would feel it in your chair. Like it was a fully immersive experience, best theatrical experience.
Yeah, you had like a 4D adventure there.
Only in New York. I don't know why.
Well, because it's New York. New York does everything.
True.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. To your point, though, yeah, there's a reason why. If enough time goes by, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to dip back into that pool per se. And again, if something's in development for that long, and actually, makes a company go under, best to leave it alone. So Duke Nukem Forever definitely belongs on the list of flops.
I'm also going to. So I've never actually played this game, but it came across in my research.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like all right. So when you're talking, I'm a huge cinephile, and I love studying movies. And I think one of the most innovative films of its time for the animation genre is definitely Disney's Fantasia.
Okay.
And apparently in 1991, Sega actually had put out a Fantasia game.
Yes, they did.
And it looks awful.
Describe how it looks awful, Josh. Maybe you should play it on the stream next week to see just how awful it is. But talk to us. Why is it awful?
All right. So apparently there is unaspiring. This is coming right from gamers. So in the Fantasia game, you need to transfers through uninspiring levels, collecting musical notes to deliver it to the game's composers. If you collect enough of these treasured music notes before reaching the end of the level, guess what? You're going to get it back. Fun. Even more damning is when the Fantasia game was released, technology wasn't at the point where you could listen to the orchestrated music, so the result is a soundtrack made up of butchered renditions of international masterpieces. The best you can say about the Fantasia game was that it looks pretty good for something released in 1991, so maybe just a sloppy output is what it sounds like.
Well, yeah. I mean, plus when you're making a game that is based on a film where the music is probably one of the primary drivers of the film, when you're getting back that 16-bit, MIDI melody of these classic orchestral, pieces, it just doesn't compare. Now, fast forward, if you make a game like that today, where you can actually showcase the music, the actual pieces in your game, I bet it would be a completely different experience.
Absolutely. And I feel like now I think that, one of the reasons that it was so innovative is, between its theatrical release and the actual game, like you're talking like 40 years. Mm-hmm. So like music has developed so much in it, and like a lot of the 80s and the 90s, they are iconic for their music. And like you can just listen to like certain films, like certain soundtracks, keep talking about movies.
Mm-hmm.
But you can hear certain sounds and automatically say that's Mario, or that is King Kong or Donkey Kong, blah. Or that is Castlevania, or you can just, there's certain music like that's Zelda. You could automatically distinguish what is what, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
well, I'm sorry. I was going to say, no, you hit the nail on the head there. And you can quote movies all you want, Josh. We know what a big movie fan you are, so it's okay. But no, you're absolutely right there. And that's probably the reason why this one was panned. And you're also going to remember, Disney in the early 90s, like early to mid 90s, they were churning out some really great games on the 16-bit systems, because we had some big hits like, Aladdin and The Lion King, where if you go back and play them, some of the best games, Mickey's Castle of Illusion was another one. Like they had really, really great games. And again, you're always going to misfire once in a while. So, Fantasia was just one of those.
Yeah. And which is sad. Like it because like Fantasia has always been, I think, a film that has really inspired me, and was like one of like the first films that like I got into when I developed my passion for film,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes me sad that there exists a poor man's version on video game consoles everywhere.
Well, maybe you should write to the mouse and let them know that they need to rectify this situation.
Well, I think, all right, like, you know how there are like certain like books or like movies out there that have been like made within like the last like 10 years since we've been like a more like technologically advanced with like CGI and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And how if they were made in like the 80s and the 90s, they wouldn't have been as good or like visually stunning. Like maybe it's time for a Fantasia uh
Remake.
remake on a console.
Maybe I know. Well, I know they tried a sequel in the film, for a film with Fantasia 2000, but that didn't sit well with people. So don't
No.
know. Maybe that's one of those. Maybe that's just one of those. Maybe that's one of those franchises that we just leave alone. I don't know. I'll leave it at that. Um, but moving on to a couple of other beauties that I have on my list. And I'm going to lump these two together because it's really about the system that these were created on. Because this company had no idea what to do with these licenses, and they were trying to take advantage of being one of the first CD-based systems on the market. And I'm talking about the Philips CDI, which shockingly enough managed to get the rights to create Mario and Legend of Zelda games on the CDI. And as a result, we wound up with let's say it, the worst Mario and Zelda games ever created. I think it's pretty clear to say that these things are the worst by a mile.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're talking about Hotel Mario and the two gems of Legend of Zelda, Link the Faces of Evil and Zelda the Sword of Gamelon. Now, what makes these games so bad, Josh? And I know you know a little bit about these. But first off, they were the first games, the first Mario and Zelda games, of course, but the first games to have animated cutscenes. Now, again, being a CD-based system, Philips was trying to take advantage of the fact that they were able to do animated cutscenes in a game. And when we say animated cutscenes, we're also talking about using voice, because up until that point, really, all games we're playing, we're basically reading text on a screen until we were getting to stuff like the Philips CDI, Sega CD, and so on. So they were trying to take advantage of it. So they created these animated cutscenes to go along with the game. So Hotel Mario, for example, you actually had Mario and all the characters from the Mario universe, having, talking to each other and things like that. The problem with that was the cutscenes were so horrible. They were so horrible to watch that it just, well, first off, that would have ruined the game in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
However, the game also managed to prove that it was equally as terrible. What's your goal in Hotel Mario? Basically, it's not like a standard Mario game, like a 2D side scroller or even maybe the first attempt at 3D. No, what you're doing is you're walking up and down on hotel floors, and the goal of your game, the goal on each level, on each floor, is to close the doors. That's it.
Sounds a lot like a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror.
Yeah. And then once you close the doors, you get to move on to the next level. Wow. Just wow. There's not much else you can say to that. Bad animated cutscenes, bad gameplay, makes for an awful game. There's a reason why the Philips CDI didn't last very long. And then switching over to the Legend of Zelda series, specifically, let's say, Link the Faces of Evil. Problem number one, the game is a 2D platformer. Zelda, in and of itself, the franchise is based more on either the open world top-down style or more of the 3D, the 3D based once we got to the N64. The first game that tried to do 2D platformer, which was Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link, actually, is a game a lot of people don't like because of the fact that they changed it up. Now, granted, you had a top-down view for some of it, but when you went into the dungeons, it became side-scrolling, and a lot of people did not like that. So for the Philips CDI to go in that direction was mistake number one. Mistake number two, again, the animated cutscenes were bad, the voice acting was terrible, and the gameplay itself, again, they didn't even really make an attempt to make the gameplay interesting. So between that and the other game, which was called Sword of Gamelon, you've got three really lackluster games for two very beloved franchises on a system that was destined to fail.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong about the Philips CDI, but back when Brandon and I were still doing PS Midnight Cast, we did a segment on there called The Music Moment. And basically, like, we analyzed one-hit wonders of the 90s. And I'm pretty sure that Philips CDI also put out, like, video games, like, based around, like, a day in the life of, like, an artist or something like that. Yes. With Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch and Crisscross.
That was actually I don't know if they were on the Philips CDI, but they were definitely on the Sega CD. And the reason why I tell you this is because I had one of those games. And what they were
sorry.
No, I know, me too. They were called Make My Video. And basically they were called Make My Video. Yes. And what you had was Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch was one, Crisscross was another. So what they did was they gave you a main screen in the middle, and then you had three smaller screens on the bottom. On the three smaller screens on the bottom, you had the actual music video for the song on one, and then you had stock footage on the other two. Basically, all you did in the game was you edited your own music video together based on which screen you chose as the song played out. And then when you were done, you got to play back the music video the way that you edited it. It was atrocious. Absolutely atrocious.
That seems like early, like, 2000s, like, getting a new computer, like, preteen kind of era. But, like, to know that it existed before then, that sounds awful and, like, not intriguing. Like, it just sounds like a waste of money. Not only for the people that are buying it, but for the developers as well.
Yeah, but think about it this way: if they made a profit off of it, they didn't necessarily care about the customers that were buying it. I just know that, like, these were really bad. But again, we were also living in an era where, at least at that time, where the idea of putting video into games was a big deal because it hadn't been done before. So they were trying to take advantage of it. So a lot of the games that you saw on these early systems like CDI and Sega CD, they were all full motion video. So the platform game that came with Sega CD, which was called Sewer Shark, was literally a first-person perspective game where you're tunneling through the sewers, shooting these sewer monsters or whatever. But the game was running in real time. So you were basically just you were traveling through this full motion video that would tell you to turn in a direction, and you had to turn within the right time. You had to time yourself correctly, or else you would miss your turn, and then you would lose if you missed your turn, or if you turned the wrong way. And then when you got to certain points in the game, it would go to a cutscene to tell you what was coming next, and then you would just continue the adventure. All in all, the game itself was like maybe 20 or 25 minutes long if you got it all the way from start to finish.
Sounds awful.
And it was, but at the time it was like, because I remember when I first got the Sega CD with Sewer Shark, like I was literally like watching the screen like it was Christmas morning, because it was so amazing. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. I'm watching video cutscenes, and I'm just going through this game, and it's so awesome. And full motion video was the whole thing with those games, because it was Sewer Shark, it was Night Trap, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers on the Sega CD was only basically you watched the first 5 episodes of the first season, and all they did was overlay it with press up now, press right now, press A now to continue watching the show. And if you didn't, you lost. That was basically it. But again, they were experimenting with stuff like that. When you look back on it, were all these games essentially bad? Yeah, they were. But when you were playing them back then, just because of when they came out, for some people, it was just really fun. Like, I had a lot of fun with it. Going back and playing them now, I can't. They suck. So, but it's always a nice nostalgia trip. But there's about 4 or 5 games I just listed that were all pretty bad when you think about it.
Yeah, I think that too. That is a lot of, again, just the times. Like it's just one of those kind of things where like it was awesome and it was innovative in its day, but now when you're removed from it and you come back after 10 or 15 years, it's just basically nostalgia kicked its butt and it's terrible.
Yes. I'm glad you said 10 or 15 years because it makes me feel better because it was actually 25.
I was just saying in general, bro.
Yes, I know, but now, but just think about it. But without games like that, we wouldn't have games that actually figured out how to manipulate that type of gameplay properly, and come out with a perfect example. If you've ever played the game Until Dawn on PlayStation 4, and I think it's on Xbox One, if you've ever played the game Until Dawn, it's basically a newer version of those games, of Night Trap, of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for Sega CD, because basically what you're doing in Night Trap, what you're doing in Until Dawn. Until Dawn is, it's basically like you're playing through a movie, except you're making decisions at key points, and those decisions cause a butterfly effect for how the rest of the game plays out. So it's almost like a choose your own adventure horror movie / game. And it's actually, and I've played through it. I absolutely love it. It's fantastic. And the company that made it is working on a couple of other games. So, but again, when I played that game, I immediately started thinking about all these games way back when on the Sega CD, where it's like, you know what? Now I see what they were trying to do, but now that we have the technology to execute it properly, we get a game like Until Dawn, which I highly recommend everybody play for the experience. It's just an outstanding game.
All right. Well, my turn.
Your turn.
I am going to give a unlikely choice that maybe some of the listeners have played, maybe you haven't. But mine is going to be a Game Boy game, and I did a stream of this a couple years ago, and it is unfortunately Swamp Thing. For Game Boy. There's just not really a whole lot to like keep my attention. Mm-hmm. It's a very boring game, which is very sad to me because I love Swamp Thing. Like Swamp Thing is one of my top 5 favorite DC characters. As corny as it is, I love the Wes Craven movie, and even the cartoon is like bearable from the early 90s. But the game is just so bad. Like it's boring, it's uninteresting, and the controls are fine. It's just like it's mostly like the story and like the gameplay are just very dull and unengaging.
Well, now are we talking OG Game Boy? Or are we talking Game Boy Color? Like where do you know where it fell?
It's OG Game Boy. I'm pretty sure.
So it's that bad like that bad green, like olive green graphics. Like there's just the one color for everything.
It is early Game Boy, and it looks like it also. Nope, it's just early Game Boy. Yeah. It looks like, it's like, it is like swamp green very much, and
well, at least it fits the character.
Yeah, like I don't know, like I love Swamp Thing. This one just could not get me, and like there's so much about Swamp Thing that you could make a really good game with. Like bring in, like you could have a Constantine level, you could have a Poison Ivy level. Like there's so much that you can do. Like you can do an Arcane level, and you can make it like a really horrific game, but there's nothing here to do that. Like it's just such a missed opportunity, and I feel like Swamp Thing is one of those characters in pop culture that until like has been gaining notoriety. They're getting ready to do another show for him in May, and I just feel like he's very poorly handled in this, and makes me sad.
Well, Well, I'm sorry, Josh. I know how creepy crawly things from swamps are your thing and how much you love them. I never played the Swamp Thing game because I wasn't a Game Boy fan. As I've said before, handhelds were always the bane of my existence because I couldn't handle the screen being that small. Maybe because I had bad eyesight growing up. I don't know, but it just never worked for me. So just the way you describe that game, it also further validates my reasoning behind not wanting to play handheld games. So
It's not a good game.
okay, fair enough. All right, I'm going to switch over to actually. I've only got a couple more on my list, and I believe one of them we actually do share a mutual hatred for. But I'm going to touch on this one before. I know how much of a Tomb Raider fan you are. And everybody knows how much of a Tomb Raider fan I am if you've been listening to the podcast. We've talked about Tomb Raider at length on the show. We've done a retro spotlight on it, I think, twice now, accidentally. But Tomb Raider, for all of the great renditions that they've come out with it and great games that came out with it, there was a while in the early 2000s where Lara Croft was definitely in danger of not coming back for future games because they just started to screw it up really badly. And when I say screwed up, I'm talking about Eidos, the company that made the game. And the one specifically I want to point out is Tomb Raider, Angel of Darkness. So Tomb Raider, Angel of Darkness was a game. I don't know. Did you ever play that one, Josh?
No, but we had a guest on our show last year that swore by that game. So it's a game that I've been curious to check out for a long time, but I have heard how bad it is. And there's also a great episode of a podcast, which its name is escaping me, but they talked very in depth about the behind the scenes of what what it was for the team that designed Tomb Raider, and by the time that they got to Angel of Darkness, it got worse. So I can only imagine how bad the gameplay really is.
Yeah, and basically the game came out in 2003, right? And right off the bat, the minute you start playing it, major controller issues. There was just I don't know if they just didn't, maybe to your point, if the experiences were bad with the developers, they just didn't really get into the meat of everything. And the controller issues were just it was really hard to control Lara Croft. There were a lot of glitches that popped up in the game as you were playing through the levels. It just all around made the Tomb Raider experience, painful. And remember, when you're dealing with gamer backlash, it can pretty much destroy a franchise. One bad game can end an entire franchise. And after Angel of Darkness was released and the reviews came in, the Tomb Raider franchise was basically on life support, and it took them a good 3 years before they even made another attempt at trying to made an attempt to revitalize the franchise with Tomb Raider Legend, which came out in 2006. And then they kind of fluttered for a while before they started to come back again. And I really think Tomb Raider finally started hitting its stride again somewhere around, I want to say late Xbox 360, PS3, but now on PS4 and Xbox One, the games are pretty solid again. But because of Angel of Darkness, they really almost destroyed the entire franchise.
Yeah, because a lot of the turnaround time between games was just ridiculous, and the crew that they had on it was so tiny for the things that they wanted to do, and it a lot of those games really suffered. But to your point also, that Tomb Raider is just Angel of Darkness, it isn't the only one. I've played some Game Boy games actually that are really bad. Tomb Raider is just not is a PlayStation game. It is a game that you have to sit down with a controller and really explore because of how vast the world is, and it just does not port well to something like a Game Boy Color.
No, agreed. And those Game Boy games that you brought up, I think that I tried a couple of them. I think there were actually a couple on Game. I want to say there may have been a couple on Game Gear, but I'm probably wrong on that. That was gone long before Tomb Raider. But the Game Boy games that I did play, they were 2D side scrollers. for
they're so bad.
and they're so bad. I mean, first off, Lara Croft's character takes up half the screen. Like, so it's like a giant running through this little itty bitty board. But then, yeah, her controls in it, absolutely awful. Like, there, and to your point, there are some games that do not transition to handheld very well. Again, Resident Evil was one of them I brought up earlier. Tomb Raider definitely is not something you want to go handheld with. At least when we're talking about old handheld, like I bet like on a Nintendo 3DS kind of system where you can do more 3D, games in a 3D perspective, something like that, you probably have a better shot. But making a 2D platformer of a 3D game like a Tomb Raider, it was very clear that the technology just wasn't there to support something like this, and it showed in all of the games. And again, to your point, if the developers are given ridiculously short lead times to make a game, you're not going to make a good game. Just to point out, E.T. back in the 80s for Atari, the developer had 5 weeks to make that game, and it's considered. It
shows.
Yeah, well, and it's considered fairly responsible for the video game crash of the 80s. The video game industry almost went completely out of business, and E.T. was one of the main drivers of that. And again, you can't blame the person making the game if they're told, make me a game in 5 weeks. So it's like, what are you supposed to do? So, to the credit of the developers, they did their best with a game like Angel of Darkness, but you know what? I mean, it came out looking unfinished and absolutely terrible. So just yet another franchise that created a flop.
All right, so the last game that I think is worth mentioning for is Sonic 2006. And we had a gentleman on our show when we talked about worst video games ever made, and that was actually the very first one that he had talked about. He said that for him, like they had just really built up the hype a lot for that show or for that game, and it just didn't deliver. Like the controls were really clunky, the levels were just really bad, and I've never played Sonic 2006, but Sonic is a game that I don't understand how you could mess up. Like Sonic just has like easily iconic rhythm that I feel like is really easy to produce.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really too sure why it is so hard to make that a thing.
Well, I mean, all games have their challenges, right? But here's the thing with Sonic the Hedgehog, which came out in 2006 on the Xbox 360. Now, Sonic, well beloved as a 2D platformer, right? When Sonic came out on the Sega Genesis, absolutely amazing. Here's a character that was brash, had attitude, and was fast on the screen, and that was the coolest thing about him. He just moved so fast. He was cool. And when it finally transitioned over to 3D on the Sega Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure on the Sega Dreamcast was one of my favorite games to play. Definitely one of my favorite Sonic games to play. Absolutely had a blast. And Sonic Adventure 2 also was a really solid game. And they had transitioned Sonic into 3D, which, to be honest with you, he really belonged. Like when you finally get to play as Sonic the Hedgehog in a 3D world, to just see how fast he can run and what directions he can run in. Like he was made for that. He really was. Even though the 2D games were great, I felt like 3D was his sweet spot. To your point, when it came to the Xbox 360, I don't know if it was because at that point Sega had officially gone under as a console developer. So now they were developing games for other consoles. I don't know if the transition over the other consoles were clunky or not, but you can definitely tell they didn't put the love into the game that they usually did for their own consoles. I don't know if that's necessarily an excuse, but the issue with Sonic on 360 was the camera angles were bad. It was just really hard to keep your focus on Sonic in the game. And then on top of it, kind of similar to what I said about Angel of Darkness, the game had a lot of glitches in it. There were a lot of problems while you were playing through the boards, and as a result of that, it just makes for an awful experience.
Yeah, like I feel like that would kind of turn me off too. Like that's why I'm glad that I have not played that, especially if you're building this up because if I remember correctly, like this is like the first this is the first game in the Sonic mythology that was on a non-Sega game system, correct?
No, they did have other ones on the original Xbox.
Okay.
So yeah, there were definitely other ones, and there were definitely other so-called stinkers like Sonic Shuffle, which was
Oh.
which was their version of Mario Party, and it was terrible to play through. But yeah, no, I believe on the original Xbox there was a Sonic game. There was I think Shadow the Hedgehog had a game on the Xbox, which again were also
Shadow of the game, I remember.
yeah, which was also a
With
rough game. It was a pretty rough game, but just yeah, Sonic on the 360, man. I just really think I think they just rushed out an unfinished game at the end of the day, and it kind of showed. And also there were some issues with the game in terms of the story as well. So in the game, Sonic is like he's saving a human woman. So he's actually for the first, I think, for the first real time, like, well, maybe not for the first time, but he's interacting with human beings. And when and not only that, I go in the game, he actually kisses her. So you have Sonic, that the hedgehog, an animal, kissing a human woman. Kind of weird.
Just a little bit.
Just a tad. So I'm not exactly sure what they were thinking when they decided to do that, but it kind of makes me curious as to what they're going to be, what's going to happen when we see the Sonic movie when it finally comes out. I'm hoping we don't get a situation where Sonic is making out with women, but hey, it worked for Howard the Duck and Leah Thompson way back when. I don't know.
Did it though?
No, it did not. Sarcasm. But yeah, but again, ultimately these games are basically bashed for the same things over and over again, and it's always the camera controls and the glitches. And if you don't clean up your game properly before you put it on the market, you risk your entire franchise. And Sonic is one of those, because when you think about it, to me, after Sonic on Sega Dreamcast, for me, there hasn't been a meaningful Sonic game until we got Sonic Mania last year. I believe that was last year, or 2017. Like, you're talking about, Sonic for Dreamcast, I think was probably around 2001. You're talking 16 or 17 years before there was a Sonic game, for me at least, that was worthy of playing again. That's a long time.
Oh, absolutely. Could not agree more on that one. And it's like, I think that there's still a love for that character, because honestly, look, we're getting a movie, like you said, in a couple of months, but I think at the same time, like, there is this level of quality that I think you should be having for this particular brand, especially for something as iconic as Sonic. There needs to be a continued performance of quality, like, especially when you look at how it's evolved with Sonic and Sonic 2, and then from more on, it definitely has a beautiful gameplay in the first two games alone. That's kind of the quality that I think you should pour into each of the system's games, especially if you're making good games 10 years after the original, 11 years, and then you're just kind of like, well, it's a formula now, we'll just do it. But I mean, to that point, like, look at how Marvel produces movies. There's definitely a formula, but each movie is almost as good as the last one that preceded it, with a couple of exceptions. And I think that Sonic's one of those games that it's such an easy formula time, like, it's also really easy to mess up at it.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like when you're trying to coast on what's already been pre-established, you run the risk of actually destroying what you've built. And that's the case here. And to be honest with you, that's the case with everything we've been discussing today, because all of these missteps had the, ran the risk of, ruining the franchises. Now, granted, most of the franchises we brought up survived. I was like, but they were kind of all damaged, because if you think about, how long now, Resident Evil probably being the only exception, because I feel like they kept churning out games, but like Castlevania after Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, like it took a while before there was another Castlevania game of note. Mario and Zelda managed to survive because these were just one-offs on a system that died really quickly. Nintendo never really lost their stride with those. But, Tomb Raider damaged their franchise. Duke Nukem totally damaged their franchise. And Sonic, same thing. I mean, like I said, long gap between a really memorable Sonic game. So all of these franchises, gamers don't look. Gamers will speak up when a game is bad, and they'll let you know it, and it shows in the sales. So it's just on the developers to really put as much love and passion that they can into a game to make the best possible product they can, as opposed to just churning out something for the sake of making money. Because when they do that, it shows. And I think we pretty much covered that. Over all of the games that we did discuss. Now, granted, we didn't get into movie-based tie-in games. If we did that, we'd be here for another 6 hours. So that, and we've covered that before on the show, and I know that's something we could always talk about at length. But that's just a whole other story.
Absolutely. Like, I think when I was starting to get like really into video games as a kid, some of the games that like I picked up on the PlayStation and the Game Boy, the systems I had at the time, were movie tie-ins, and they were god awful.
Yep, that they were. But again, like I said, that's a topic for another show. I think we're gonna start wrapping this sucker up, Josh. And you know what? I mean, I feel like we've definitely touched on a lot of great franchise flops. For those of you out there, watching and listening, we would love to hear from you. What are some of your most memorable, and granted, these aren't great memories, but what are some of your most memorable franchise flops that you remember playing and saying, oh my God, what the hell did they do? We would love to hear from you and hear about that. Outside of that, Josh, this has been great. I'm so happy you decided to stick around, unlike my so-called co-host who hightailed it after 60 seconds on the show. I hope his tears are, falling all into the Long Island Sound as he weeps for his poor little virtual boy. But Josh, where can our listeners find you?
Sure. So you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net, where you guys can find past episodes of our show, reviews for books, movies, and possibly here in the future video games. And you guys can also get resources if you or someone is struggling with suicide prevention. If you guys don't know what our show is, it is the marriage between pop culture and suicide prevention, and we put out content that makes people aware of that and really tries to derail the stigma around mental health.
Very cool. And again, if you've never listened to Victims and Villains, I highly recommend it. It's a great show. Like Josh always says, they talk nerd, they talk everything, especially from a cinemaphile like Josh. Does some great movie reviews. He's always talking about stuff. And I know you just dropped one on Shazam, correct?
Shazam! Yeah.
Shazam, which I actually saw and thought was a fun movie. So definitely check out the latest episode of Victims and Villains where Josh reviews Shazam. And then for us here at the Retro Gamers, you can find us at facebook.com/retrogamerspodcast. You can go to our website, www.theretrogamers.com. We're on Instagram at retrogamerspodcast. And you can listen to us anywhere where you subscribe to podcasts, or if you want, you can watch our shows on YouTube at, just look up the Retro Gamers Podcast. You will find us over on YouTube. And for one last thing, please make sure you tune in next weekend to the Victims and Villains Hope Station live stream, where I know, Josh, you put together a great slew of gamers to do a 48-hour stream of some of their favorite games to raise money and awareness for suicide awareness. I said awareness twice, but that's what I did.
That's all good. We start that at youtube.com/victims and villains, and that starts April 12th at noon, and it'll go until April 14th at noon as well.
Yeah, it's going to be 48 nonstop hours. And do what you can. Just if you want to tune in and watch, if you can, when you get there, if you can donate, that would be awesome too. Anything and everything can help. If you can't donate, sharing the stream will help as well. Really looking forward to being a part of that, Josh. And that wraps it up for this week. So thank you everybody for watching and listening. Thank you, Josh, for joining me again. No thank you to Larry for ditching us. And we will see you next week on the Retro Gamers Podcast.
Yes, you will.